This
Karen,
conference will now be recorded.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome. I'm Joe Marion. I'm president of the Cloud Communications Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, for this virtual meeting. Just a couple things I'm going to go through real quickly. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors for today, Cloudage, and give you guys from Cloudage, just step up and just say a few words. Tell us about your company, please.
Sure. Just get it, Chris.
Go ahead, Bob. Sure,
okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So so we're Cloudage Solutions. Bob Norberg, CMO, and Chris Lee, CEO, and we're proud members of the Cloud Communications Alliance for a couple of years now. And you'll hear more about what we do, how we can help. But we have a SaaS platform that helps offer managed network services and provides capabilities in terms of ordering, quoting, inventory management, cost management, but also usage management with CDR analytics and validation. We also have a variety of services. One you'll hear a little bit about today has to do with our voice cost optimization service. And so that's a quick promo. We'll talk more about this kind of at the end.
Great, Bob. Thank you very much. And it's just a couple how to use your portal, if you will. First of all, we have a mute button. If you're not going to be speaking, click your mute button. That'll just give us a little bit more bandwidth, and it'll kind of eliminate some of the background noise. We have a chat button. So if you want to click on that chat button, you can send texts to anybody or everybody on the call. We're going to hold the questions till the end. But if you want to talk to anybody one-on-one, use the chat button. And we have a webcam. I'm going to suggest everybody, except the speakers, turn off your webcam. At the end of the conference, we can turn it back on again and chat just a little bit more. You can take a look at everybody who's on the call, or you can take a look at who's speaking. So you can set your view any way you like. With that, let me turn over to Bob and the folks from Cloudage and talk a little bit about voice fraud mitigation. Guys, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Joe. Okay, if you can go ahead and hit next slide. Okay, so just quick introductions. I'll introduce everybody. We have Chris Lee, who's the CEO and founder of Cloudage Solutions. Tons and tons of experience in the telecom area around voice networks. We have Mark Lindsey, senior member of technical staff at ECG Consulting. Really a top technical expert in this area as well. And I'll be the host / moderator today. I'm Bob Norberg. I'm the CMO of Cloudage Solutions. Next. So a couple different things. We're kind of breaking today up into 4 different areas. The first thing, we're just going to kick it off with, kind of toll fraud. Why do you care? Is it a big deal? Is it a little deal? Just give you guys some perspective. The second thing we want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what are the most common ways we're seeing the bad actors attack. Where are things that you need to be looking into for vulnerabilities? Then we're going to say, okay, what can you do about that? What are some of the top best practices you can do? Some very easy, some you can do immediately to start to reduce those risks and those costs. And then we're going to kick it off, finish it up with what can I do first, right? It's going to be a big thing. It's not an ending thing, right? It's a continuous process. What should I do now? So we'll finish it up with that. So if you can go next slide, please. So, the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about, this really does happen, right? Real fraud's out there. And if you read the press, obviously everybody knows that. People in this industry really know that. But to put it in perspective, I know the CFCA does an annual survey, and it really is amazing that about $28 billion a year is lost to fraud. And probably the more important metric in my mind is that works out to be about 1.74% of revenue that in the industry is kind of lost to fraud. So you think if you're managing costs, you're managing margin, you would love to be able to take that number, right? When you're, in telecommunications where margins are tight, you want to be able to squeeze out every little bit. So this might be an area where you can really address it, and kind of go after that. I know, Chris, I know you've got some experience with this as well in terms of some of the incidents you've seen, kind of the next level down.
Sure, no, absolutely, Bob. The real main reason you should care is margin. These fraud events range from as low as 5, 10K per event up to $250,000 or more if not detected early enough. We're talking those types of numbers. Those losses really can wipe out months of voice margins for some providers. But on the bright side, these events can be avoided and mitigated to some extent. To put in perspective, I had a customer a while ago that we were talking to them about our CDR analytics service, and the claim was, well, it's kind of pricey service. Until about 3 months later, we never really did the deal with. 3 months later, they were hit with a $500,000 fraud event over a weekend, which made the CDR analytics service look great in terms of value. So it's definitely one of those pay now or pay more later type decisions for sure.
Yeah, I know, Mark, as we were preparing for this, and I found this amazing, is you had an interesting anecdote about what AT&T was reporting about one of the growing kind of threats or entry points for a lot of the fraud.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, historically, a lot of folks worried about the security on their PC-based platforms as kind of as an entry point, or obviously on session border controllers and other application servers and voice networks. Those things have got to be considered. But kind of one of the rising trends over the last few months is really that Android itself has taken off as a major platform for the cyber criminals, for the bad actors, especially for organized crime. They're using Android malware to get access to your platform and to do actions that you wouldn't authorize. So one of the recent attacks was some Android malware that was able to look at your multi-factor authentication that came in, or to be able to access your banking apps where you have saved credentials on your device. And you can readily imagine that the same kind of remote access could give them the ability to launch calls through your service provider. So if you're deploying an Android app to be able to place calls, then you are entering an ecosystem which is an active target for criminals. So getting the credentials off the Android device, that would be one of the risks, being able to use the Android device itself to place the calls. That's a new challenge that we all have to work with.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's actually a good transition. So if you can hit next slide. So what we want to do is, Mark and Chris have tons of experience in this area. Hit next one more time. Is look at some of the more common attack vectors, and while, Mark just talked about the Android kind of growing, but like, what are the most common things that you really need to think about when you're looking at this? I know, Mark, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of, one way they can do it is just by getting access, different ways to get access to your system.
Yeah, so the inbound access by which the attackers come in, it evolves over time. I mentioned Android, that's kind of a new target. I mean, when we were, within this industry, starting to roll out Android calling apps to support our platforms, just a few years ago, Android really wasn't the target that it is today. But some of the things like theft of credentials, they've been kind of in a way that folks have done attacks for a while. And so, and particularly the SIP phone configurations, the configurations that you put out there to be downloaded either by one of these or by a desk phone like a Polycom or Yealink or any of the other great models that are out there. Those devices have configuration files stored within the platform, of course, and then protecting access to those configurations is really critical, because those configurations kind of have the crown jewels in them. They have the authentication information and the configuration information that attackers need to be able to register with your system as if they were your legitimate customer, and then go through the authentication process fully, and then be able to place outbound calls. And so that continues to be an ongoing challenge in an area that needs to be directly addressed. Sometimes it's a different kind of problem. So instead of stealing the SIP phone credential from either the SIP phone or from your server, sometimes what they do is they actually exploit the endpoint itself. So the IAD, if you've got a SIP PBX, the attacker could access that and then launch their calls outbound through it. That continues to happen quite a bit. Sometimes this happens by using the APIs, the programmable APIs, the CTI interface, for example, on some of these advanced phones that are used for UCaaS. They'll have an interface that enables outbound calls to be placed. That kind of access can be used to place calls from the customer's environment. So you may have defenses that say we're only going to allow our customers to come through the VPN that we built, and yet the attackers are able to come through that same VPN if they're able to gain access at the customer side. A couple of the other things, when you manage your service, you give your customers a portal to log in and change their settings. Maybe it's managing their call forwarding settings, managing where their voicemail goes, looking at their old call logs, their call history. That sometimes those call management portals are part of the attack vector, the way that attackers are getting in. And so you start having to think in terms of multi-factor authentication you might need to add just to let somebody log in to look at your call logs. Now, you might need to do something like that anyway to follow the CP&I regulations to protect your system. But basically, the system that you have that maybe were never a major hot target before could become a hot target. And then, sometimes the other APIs that are provided either for management of services or even for calling. So a lot of great service providers, CCA members, will have an API that can be used to connect into the service and then to trigger outbound calls. Maybe use it for screen pop applications for your contact center customers. Well, those APIs become input targets as well, so that you can have attackers who are investigating these things in order to find out how they can place and trigger calls, even without getting anybody's telephone involved. They'll do this. We see this kind of attack happening, and if you think about it, if a typical attack is between $10,000 and $100,000, what we're seeing is that there's evidence that organized crime is doing serious investment in understanding your platform to figure out what those vulnerabilities are. And those are just some of the heavy hitters. Those are not the whole thing. Those are not all of the potential, input points, Bob.
Okay, that's awesome. So Chris, so one thing, Mark, that you talked on there, you talked a little bit about kind of placing outgoing calls. If you can hit next slide, Chris, like you've seen a lot of things like that. You can start to see how people attack by just making outbound calls and how things can be recognized. I know you've had a lot of experience with some of the people we've talked to there.
Sure, absolutely, Bob. Just talk about a couple of typical patterns that we see with these things. Typically, when you have like a large fraud event, if you start looking at the CDRs, you'll notice that they are very often preceded by a smaller event, maybe hours or a day before. Basically what these are test calls where the fraudsters are looking to determine if the system they've gotten compromised access to has access to some of the premium numbers where it'll be compensated, determines what type of response there may be from the provider, understands if they've got call forwarding enabled so they can attack that way. Most of these attacks, just about all the ones we've seen, happen either overnight or on weekends. And that's the signature. It's where there's less people that can respond to these events. If you look at the CDRs, what you see in the CDRs are large groups of calls with really a lot of the patterns you see are have the same exact info, the same from and to numbers, date, time, and duration. And they indicate that they're leveraging call forwarding. It's like one of the major vectors to do this. Also see individual calls that have long durations that are going to the classic high cost destinations. On the international side, it's the premium numbers. There's probably 50 to 80 countries that are the leading offenders. What we see continually are destinations like Estonia, Sierra Leone. Western Africa is big, Sao Tome, Congo, Barbados, Barbados in the Caribbean. These premium numbers are, like just think about like in the States, the 900 numbers. They're where the compensated, the number owner is compensated for the calls. On the domestic side, we see a lot of calls to high cost areas like Iowa and South Dakota. South Dakota has been a big one for the last several years. Really what we see behind that call traffic is free conference calling services are the main ones there. So that's kind of a review really from a pattern standpoint on the outbound call side.
So Mark, you have anything to add there?
Yeah, there's some interesting new things that kind of layer on top of what you just covered, Chris. So one of the things we continue to have to look into is dial plan bypass. So you guys would want to put that on your checklist. So for example, in a Broadworks platform, in a lot of other kind of carrier-sized design platforms, you're going to have both regular 10-digit dialing, NAMPA dialing, or you'll have E164 dialing. Well, a lot of times the E164 dialing, which is where you have something like +1 and then a 10-digit number. Well, that's not part of your everyday experience, but you might use that on your carrier, in and I type interfaces, or maybe between certain PBXs. So, for example, SIP Connect, it's a new requirement for the DoD for military contracts. You might start to see SIP Connect more, and so SIP Connect might use those E164 formatted numbers. Well, in some cases, when that call comes into the system, it either gets routed over and handled as a NAMPA call, and you might have those restrictions, for expensive destinations that Chris just mentioned, like Caribbean and parts of Africa and Middle East. But then on the E164 side, the +22 or actually, for example, +229. It's my area code in the United States, but it also happens to be the country code for the African nation of Benin. And so if you don't have your call routing set up right, you don't have the restrictions distributed on both sides, both your kind of your non-E164 side and your E164 side, then you might have an exposure there that you didn't intend to have. And so what I hope is just being aware of that will help you to ask that question and ensure that gets taken care of. We also see some interesting cases. I mentioned the APIs. You've got devices like Alexa that can call grandma now. Well, what if you say, Alexa, call Gambia? If you're placing an outbound international call to an expensive destination, and you've built an app that's integrated with the Amazon App Store or with Google or others, and you have a really cool feature there. Well, do you have the protections that you would need on that system as well? And then like Chris mentioned, call forwarding is a huge it's been a huge target for over 10 years now, but call transfers are sometimes an issue where we'll see the engineers who are working for the bad actors are actually finding ways to do call transfers that evade the calling protection. So maybe they set up a domestic call or even a local call, and then they do a call transfer to an international or a high cost destination, and sometimes the call transfer is not checked as thoroughly. And so you really do want to be thinking about kind of all of those ways, identify all of the ways that customers can place outbound calls.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Good point, Mark. And actually, if you can hit next slide, that actually transitions, and it was kind of the last point, which is, a lot of this is about profit, right? There are, international revenue sharing fraud, destinations are different. Chris even touched upon that. Think about the destinations and that there are reasons why people want to route traffic to certain areas, and they're going to use fraud to be able to kind of get in there to be able to do that. Chris, I think you talked a little bit about that in the previous point, but really thinking about the destinations and how you set your things up is really important.
Right, Bob. Yeah, as you mentioned, there's the motivation behind this is profit. These bad guys aren't doing this for fun. They're certainly getting paid. And as Mark mentioned earlier, very organized. So it goes by there's several kind of groups. There's hackers that gain access to systems as a regular part of what they do. They sell this access on dark web sites, other sites. There's traffic generating. I call them agents. In air quotes that drive the events and traffic. And there's actual websites that advertise these premium numbers that are available for use, and they'll give the number ranges, the numbers, the compensation rates, and all that sort of stuff. It gets down to where the terminating carriers are really compensating these traffic generating agents, and that drives this forward. On the law enforcement side, they mostly don't have the resources, so they don't go after these issues, these crimes. I would think that something potentially could be done on the U.S. Side for traffic pumping, the rural termination, because that it's mostly freeconferencing.com and those types of conferencing providers that potentially jurisdictionally in the U.S. maybe U.S. authorities would have a better chance going after that, but without any other deterrent value, this really continues to be an issue. one thing that was recently brought to my attention by a CCA member, Michael Pryor with Brownstein, was that the FCC has opened a rulemaking in NPRM on what's called one-ring scams. And a one-ring scam is where a call from a premium number calls a unsuspecting person, and they hang up after one ring. The person says, "Oh, I missed a call," and calls the number back, and then gets hit with like a $2 per minute type rate. So the FCC is actually considering allowing carriers to block calls from these international premium numbers, which up until now, there's a common carrier obligation to not block calls coming in. So that's interesting. It's out there right now, being commented on by the industry. So we'll see where that goes. Another thing I wanted to differentiate on with this stuff is really talk about fraud and also talk about unacceptable use. If someone accesses a communication system without authorization and makes calls to say like South Dakota and these things, and so that's clearly a fraud, right? So it's unauthorized access and they're making calls. But where a subscriber of a service provider calls South Dakota, that's really what I would call unacceptable use. And that could be a margin killer as well. I want to touch on through a case study that I'll briefly tell you about. A former customer a few years ago was actually this entity was an independent company, but it's now actually was acquired by a CCA member. But they were offering unlimited voice seats at a fixed price. They had numerous, and I'll put customers again in air quotes, that had many lines and generating amazing amounts of traffic to South Dakota. And the configuration on this particular carrier's open source UCAS system allowed calls to be in flight for up to 24 hours, which obviously is a no-no. And one of these customers actually had, they were generating monthly revenue around $1,300. They had 48 lines at about a $28 per line cost, but they were generating termination costs of around $35K because they were blasting these 48 lines off. They're off hook pretty much 24/7 for the whole month. But the really frustrating part about it is, the carrier couldn't immediately, block the calls. Like basically when they brought us in, we did some CDR analytics on it and showed them, but they couldn't immediately block the calls because the carrier has a common carrier obligation. You can't block calls. So what they had to do was rewrite, and we helped them rewrite their terms of service to make sure these calls fell under unacceptable use so that the customers could be terminated. But it took another 45 days of big losses to do this. And so it's just be mindful of that. If you see users, in your customer base with long duration calls to rural locations, they're probably using some type of free conferencing. If you have a flat rate, unlimited product, it might be worthwhile. It will be worthwhile to do some analysis on the usage. And if it's conferencing that they're using and they're using a decent amount, it may make sense actually to offer your own audio conferencing service for free, because if you think about it, if most or some of the users on that service are on your UCAS service, then they're essentially free because they're on net. And then the rate for any outsiders to dial in will be much lower than a rate you would have, or the rate that's currently used through freeconferencing.com termination. So actually offering a free service to some customers would actually reduce your overall cost, because if it's a flat rate service, you're not getting any incremental revenue anyway. So it's really just a matter of reducing cost. And so it's something to maybe look at. It's not, again, what I wanted to make the point on it, that's not fraud per se, but it's unacceptable use and it's a margin killer. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good point, Chris. And that's it kind of goes back to the point we made earlier, right? If you think on average it's 1.74% of revenue, right? It's really about managing expenses and managing margin to make sure that even if you have it under control, you don't let it get out of control, because that's an important aspect. You can get out of control in a hurry. We can hit next slide.
Hey, Bob, let me actually touch on something. There's an interesting
Absolutely.
point. Just on that, I want to point out that Chris made a really good point about obligations to terminate the calls. And and we had a question that came in about South Dakota. And the reason is the question about sort of South Dakota as a threat, like Chris said, these are high cost destinations. Now there's some good news there. One is that the FCC, I'm not an attorney. You should talk to Jonathan Marashlian, the common law group, if you want a good attorney. But on these details. But and this isn't legal advice. But the FCC is changing the rules to eliminate that high cost thing. So that's good. That'll really help when that goes through. Then those high cost destinations should be fewer within the United States. But yeah, those can be incredibly high cost scenarios where it's legal to call those destinations, but just like you said, Chris, it's it can be abused and you want to be sure that your agreements with your customers deal with that. But one of the interesting sides that makes that really tough is that more than just your obligation to terminate calls, there's the Rural Call Completion Act, which specifically protects calls to rural areas. And so places like Iowa and South Dakota and all have a higher level of protection than calls to Atlanta or New York City or Los Angeles under the law. Again, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but that's what the rules actually say. Now there are the rules about what you're allowed to block and not block are incredibly complicated. Just like you said, the one ring scam, that's a proposed rule that allows you to block calls that you believe to be based to be a source of a one ring scam. That's a powerful new tool that was I'm glad you brought that up, Chris. That was just announced by the FCC as a proposed rule, and that probably will go into effect because usually their proposed rules do go into effect. But it used to be really simple. You couldn't block any calls, and now when we cover in our regulations training for engineers, when we cover kind of what you're allowed to configure your system to block, it's about like 9 different elements you have to consider, including, is this a 911 call? Because you can never block a 911 call. So when you're building out your protection system, there's a lot of details to work through. But you can, when you apply all of the tools that the FCC has permitted, it's a lot better now than it was 5 years ago.
Oh, that's a great point. Thanks, Mark. So we just reviewed a lot of the kind of typical attack vectors, and so you hear that, like, the one thing that that we've seen is that there's a variety of different personas. You can call it kind of the state that your company's in and how you're addressing this. And and persona is one of those things that's kind of easy. You can see yourself being one of those people. And so the first one, is I call it the gambler, right? And this is, we choose to accept the risk, or it won't happen to us, right? And this isn't necessarily, like, the gambler isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Because you can be on one end of the spectrum where you've done the analysis, you've looked at the cost, you've looked at the risk, and you say, hey, the risk reward, we think we're in a good spot, but it's still a risk. The other side is where you don't want to be, is it's not going to happen to me, right? And so we have a picture in there of, it's Matt Damon in the poker movie he was in. And at the end of the day, right, you don't want to use a poker term, have a bad beat, right? Where you play the hand perfectly, you think you got it all squared away. You show up with a pair of kings and a pair of queens, and someone throws 3 7s at you, and you thought you played it well. So, from that perspective, it's still okay to be there, but you got to pay attention to it. Chris, why don't you, there's a couple of these, we can talk about. One is, the do-it-yourself guy.
Sure, yeah. Let me take that one. I would run into that a lot. This persona, very capable and likely has the ability to build something effective to identify and detect fraud. That is, if they had the time. They have so many different things they're dealing with, and so if they had just that one thing to focus on, sure, they could do it. So they typically deploy solutions that end up having holes in them, and so as attack vectors and attack techniques change, they're in kind of this whack-a-mole scenario where there's a $10,000 event here, fix that type of vulnerability, 20K event over here, fix that, and never really stay ahead of it, and along the way are just losing, bleeding kind of margin through that.
Yeah, and that's again, and that's not a bad thing. And I think in a lot of these cases, you do realize the enormity of these issues, and and that's where kind of like the next one, is the often overlooked. And this is where you can address some of the issues, but there's other aspects you haven't been able to get to. I know, Mark, you have a bunch of experience with this with some of the clients you've talked to.
Yeah, you have to believe that the problem is solvable, but you have a determined adversary. So when we talk about, Verizon reported last year, like I mentioned, that the major source of cybersecurity attacks was actually organized crime. So you're up against organized crime, and that's before we really start thinking about nation state actors. We're not really worried about nation states usually, although there is evidence that North Korea is active in this space in general as a way of defrauding to mostly what they're using is ransomware. But there are nation states that are active to try to basically get money. They set up schemes like this in order to get money. But some of the challenges are addressed by the commercial vendors. Equinox, for example, fraud solution where they have a team that's continuously making that platform better. And some of the tools that you get with or that you can overlook easily are things like communication. So often you may be able to detect fraud, but how do you alert the right people, and how do you ensure that alerting is really functional? That's one of the things you want to look into. And if you're building and maintaining a platform, I encourage you look into that. How do you actually notify folks, and do you notify folks in a way that you're sure that it's going to work all the time? Do they respond? Are you able to get the appropriate kind of response? Because detection is good. It's a fundamental necessity, but being able to stop and mitigate it. And sometimes the response equation is one where the difference between a 1 hour response time, being able to get in and get an engineer to go look at the problem and mitigate within an hour, can be far more expensive than getting somebody who can mitigate within 10 minutes. And so getting the right kind of situation where you've got the right people who have the ability to respond and then to deal with it when it happens rapidly. That's another important piece. And then improvement, being able to take what you learn from this and then push it back. So like you said, Bob, you can play a game of whack-a-mole where you're just trying to patch up little leaks here and there. But improvement needs to be a disciplined thing. I've had the privilege of working with the cybersecurity of voice operations within parts of the federal government, and honestly, this is one area where they really shine. I think the mindset there is not, we don't think about the federal government as being particularly efficient, but what some of the leadership within the civilian organization to do is do a really good job at looking at what went wrong. Nobody's going to get fired here. We're not looking here to chop heads. We are looking to figure out what went wrong, and then let's ensure that it's fixed. And then whatever we fix in 2020 is still present in 2021, that we're able to maintain that. So that ability to grow your organizational maturity is actually something that they tend to do, and some of those organizations they tend to do really well. And that's what we want. We want to have the ability to look at what went wrong and then to implement improvements that really improve the overall maturity of our platform.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. And really, at the end of the day, the last one, and it's more common than I think than people realize, is that many companies just don't have the expertise or resources. I know I worked at a security software company for a while, and it's a very different world. And it's like, and as we've talked here, it's like a never-ending world. Things are constantly changing. It's even more quickly. And so it's okay to say, hey, I don't have the expertise to do this. I've admitted it's a real issue that can impact costs, but I may need to go get some expertise. I need to get additional resources so that I adequately do that. So, it's okay to be in that bucket, but realize that there are resources out there that you can go get. So if you could hit next slide. And hit next one more time. So the next thing we want to do is kind of run through 3 different kind of general ways you can address it. And there's lots of details, within each of them, but we're going to kind of hit 3 different general areas. And the first one, Mark's going to talk a little bit about, what are some of the detection techniques that you can use to at least say, I need to be able to figure out if something is happening.
Yeah, so the attacks
so
definitely.
Mark, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, the attacks definitely change over time, and sometimes it'll be a lot of concurrent calls, where you've got a high volume of traffic, and then sometimes actually we had a really good point that came out about What about a small fraudster that hits multiple times? They're only costing you maybe $10 or $20 each incident, but then they come back and hit. And I think actually the work that Cloudage does is really great here, because they're able to analyze and kind of look back historically. You may not have lost more than $100, potentially on this particular fraudster, but that's kind of it. You have to take the time to go back and do the CDR analytics to look at that, because there could be a vulnerability there that could be patched. And I would rather you have that $100 rather than have it, wasted and lost. So doing that kind of look back to find those slow burn, kind of that small bleeding, can be really important. And I think that's one of the things I've seen a lot of case studies and experience from Cloudage, on that. Just to brag on my friends here at Cloudage. Other times it could be the call transfers or out dials, and you want to have detection mechanisms. One of my concerns, there's kind of pros and cons. One of my concerns is, any one detection method can have its limits. So, for example, if you have SIP-based detection, so you're looking at how digits are dialed, then you want to be sure that that's able to look at all of the possible ways the digits are dialed. So if you've got, for example, an asterisk-based platform, then there are a lot of ways that you can actually send in a phone call to that. You can put it in the refer to header, in a refer message. You can put it obviously in the request URI. There's a lot of places in the SIP header. And so you want to be sure that your software is able and understands all of those possible places. That takes some thorough testing, but that's one of the advantages of getting a mature vendor who's been doing this for a while, rather than you having to run your own software development organization and kind of discover all this institutional knowledge yourself. But all of those different ways of placing and transferring and forwarding calls, you want to be sure that you're detecting them. One of the strengths of CDR-based analysis is that it's able to look at the call destination after the soft switch has analyzed it, so it knows, oh, this was a call to Gambia. It's able to detect where that call is going and actually record that in the CDR to route it. Versus SIP-based methods, which sometimes can be tricked by funny digit dialing patterns. But the problem with CDR-based methods is usually they're after the fact. They can be too late and too slow. And in Chris's blog article that he posted in February, he actually mentions, and I'll send out a link to that. He actually mentions that as kind of one of the downsides of CDR based detection. But one of the other things here is when you detect things, how do you communicate? And I mentioned that before, but the big question is, do the right people get notified, and do they do something about it when they get the notification? So let's say your carrier actually detects that you've had some fraud, and they want to call you. Who are they going to call? Is that person going to be able to answer it? Are they going to try very hard, or are they going to go through a call list? How are they going to notify the right people? Because you'd hate to come in on Monday morning and find out that you have 7 voicemails where they were trying to help you on Friday night, and then eventually they gave up on Saturday because the problem kept going. But they did what they said they would do. So figuring out how you're going to do that communication, that's a huge piece of it, because you may be able to mitigate and stop the fraud. Maintaining it, keeping the detection up to date with kind of what's changing in the industry, that's an advantage of scale. So if you're AT&T and you're in charge of fraud at AT&T for soft switch platforms, then you have the advantage of you can absorb some of the costs, and then you can learn and innovate across your entire organization. But if you're like most of us, where you operate in 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 markets, then you don't necessarily have the privilege to do that, to absorb those kind of costs. And that's where vendors like Equinox, Transnexus, others who are offering services, they're able to learn from one customer, and then you get the advantage of it. So that other customer had an incident, it was cleaned up, the software was improved, and then you get the benefit from that. And so those are, though, that communication and response process, and then the ongoing innovation is one of the big things that you get out of using a commercial fraud software.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And so next, if you can hit next. So the other thing you can do, right, is you can actually start to take some proactive prevention techniques. And like Mark, thanks a lot for the shout out on Chris's blog post. And Chris's blog post goes into a bunch of these different techniques. Chris, why don't you kind of fill in a little bit what some of the top ones are? And like a lot of these are really simple ways to try and prevent a lot of these things from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's best practice stuff, right? So things like limiting privileges on new seats, more operating under more of like a whitelist model. So only allowing opening up of the high risk destinations based on requests from customers versus having them wide open to start. Other attack vectors should be shut down. So that we've talked about, the excessive number of call forwarding paths that are that could be open, allowing excessive call durations. If you were to analyze CDRs and see that the duration, if you put the duration there like a bell curve, there's very few calls that are more than 20-30 minutes. So certainly don't need to have 4-hour call duration required. Allowed. The longer call durations, again, what Mark alluded to, when your main way of identifying fraud is through CDRs, becomes problematic if calls are allowed to remain in flight for really long periods of time. It becomes problematic, obviously expensive. Not allowing non-supported devices. Mark, I think, touched on this before as well. We all hear that story where the sales guy runs in, the guy gets great, he gets an awesome 400-seat deal, but the customer already has these phones. He has to use those phones, or the deal's no good. And it just so happens that those phones are non-supported or non-lockable type securable type devices that open you up to risk. So kind of be mindful of that. Certainly some education to be done on customer security hygiene, especially if you're using non-standard, non-secured type devices. The last thing is the automation of CDR analytics to identify the anomalies early. So if the call durations are relatively short, then you should be able to detect anomalies relatively the early part of a fraud event, which will allow you to kind of close the door, so to speak, to mitigate some of the damage that can be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. If you can hit next. And I think the last thing, when all else fails, and Mark kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, is that when something happens, right, and you detect the event, you need to be able to have some sort of kill switch. You have to, if you know that something's happening, how can you stop things from kind of going forward so that you're just not throwing money out the window. And I know Chris and Mark, we were talking about, kind of this automated shutdown becoming more common, but there's a lot of trade-offs for that. While you're trying to manage costs, there's also potentially customer impacts, whether it's legitimate calls or not. It's a fairly heavy-handed step, but what's your guys' experience been with kind of automated shutdown to kind of help use that kill switch?
I think one area that you should look at doing, so not all of the carriers that provide international termination services have the same capabilities, but there are a few out there that have the ability to shut down a route, a trunk group, or an ANI based segment based on certain thresholds, minutes or dollars spent. And to the extent that you use carriers that offer that type of service, certainly leverage that. But what I do is a step further in developing your routing strategy, identifying, like you said before, the routes matter. Like there's different risk in different countries, and I would funnel most of all the high risk stuff through providers that gave me that kind of fail safe mitigation, automated mitigation. So that's kind of one way that you could get that sort of, so to speak, the kill switch, so to speak.
Mark, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, years ago, it seemed like more people were concerned about the customer service impact of blocking calls. I mean, we've worked with clients who had customers who they did a lot of outbound calling to non-U.S. locations, Europe and Asia, and obviously these are happening in inconvenient hours. This may not be when your top tier customer service folks are in the office, and so if you automatically shut it down and then they need to continue to make calls, then what's that customer experience going to be like? So that used to be kind of one of the big things that was talked a lot about. It seems like, though, just especially after you've been burned, with 6-digit numbers of dollars lost, then folks are willing to accept that that customer service hit in more cases. So shutting it down automatically, shutting down traffic. You know, Chris mentioned the anti-based blocking, the shutting down traffic from a customer or from a group or wherever the cost limitations are, I think would be it's really can be smart. And I think we're probably moving closer to an era where we're going to have something more like prepaid calling support in our platform. So even though your platform may not be fully a prepaid platform, it may be a sort of a flat rate service. There are always going to be high cost elements. Your ability to make international calls are going to be high cost for some number of years, hence. And so being able to let your system keep track of how much money has been spent. And then be able to set a limit on that. How many dollars, how many minutes of use are typical for this user, and then automatically shut them down. We see that obviously that's present on prepaid platforms. There's no reason that technology shouldn't be available on your standard soft switch platforms. And so I think that's what we'll see, is that the industry will move in that direction, because it's just a really no nonsense, simple way of addressing this.
Okay, that's a great point, Mark. If you can hit next slide, please. And so we're getting wrapped up here the last 5 minutes before we kind of go into Q&A. So a couple of points as we move forward. You know, we've kind of heard, you know, it's a real issue to help manage these costs. Looked at the way people are attacking. We looked at a variety of different ways, best practice ways that we can address this. But so, like, what's next? Like, how do you move forward? And I think, you know, a couple things to keep in mind. The first is, right, this isn't a part-time job, right? This is, you have to maintain, adapt, and evolve. And so security, certainly these days, whether it's home computing on your laptops, but also in the collaboration space and the voice space, right, you have to stay up to date on security. It has to become part of the way you do business. It has to be something that you address. But the other thing is, right, if you just sit and listen to this, right, you have to have the attitude that you can get there, right? You know, like, all these things are very big issues. You're not going to solve it all at once, and it's never going to go away, but you do have to have the attitude that you can get there. And so it's important, you know, to take that first step, start to reduce the risk. You know, don't think that, like, you have to solve all of it, but start to take that first step, right? It's, what's the term, you know, take a bite out of the elephant. You know, take that first step. So we can hit next slide. Next. Oh. Karen Nugent, oh, there you go. So we think, you know, Chris and Mark had a great idea of, like, you know, what's one step you can take that will really help. And, you know, and I think something that's really simple is just a tabletop discussion with your team, where you take an hour and go, how can you make your network safer? Mark, what a couple of the things that you can put on that agenda that people can address in that meeting?
Yeah, I knew we were going to talk about this morning, and I realized there's kind of a lot you can go through. I think that the NIST cybersecurity framework is actually a really helpful tool. And so if you're kind of on the fringes of cybersecurity, you hear the framework thing. It's a federal government document. Like, it's huge. And unfortunately, it gets misunderstood and misused sometimes. But as a thinking tool, the NIST cybersecurity framework is really kind of a great place to start. So it talks about things like identify, like, what are the voice services that we offer? What are the tools? How do folks how do get phone calls get sent in from the good guys, from the bad guys, and sent into our network? How are we doing detection today? What are our detection tools for these things? And, you know, are we handling call transfers? Are we looking at CDRs? Are we looking at SIP traffic? You know, those kind of things. Those are good conversation starters. But there were enough things. There were a few more than I wanted to try to that I wanted to verbally go over here today. So here is I wrote these down just this morning for you guys today. I posted in the chat a link to a blog article, and it walks you through just using the NIST cybersecurity framework just as a discussion tool. So if you take this article and pull it up, and I think it could be really helpful going through those things like identifying where your input points are, how you're doing protection today, what are our tools or security tools, you know, the things that Chris talked about, these security things. Are we doing these things, or how many of these things are we doing, or do we have other kind of mitigating controls? Detection, response, how are we communicating when things occur? How do we do recovery? You know, those things are important. So I gave you some talking points. You can use this article basically just to help lead your conversation for that tabletop exercise.
Oh, that's good. Thanks a lot for posting that, Mark. That's very helpful. Chris, anything to add, like, like on detection, and I think the checklist thing is a really good idea because a lot of times, a lot of this comes down to just, taking an assessment of what you actually do today and then start to try and fill those things in. So what are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, on the detection side, really look at upping your kind of game in the real-time CDR analytics area. Being able to detect these things and understand at a very rapid pace to understand what's going on in your network is key. Other things might be having an operations, both an ops plan and the technical capability to quickly shut the door. So if you do detect something going on, that how quick can you shut it down is a key thing, because unfortunately these things don't happen during the business days, and so it's typically the NOC that's dealing with it, which has to kind of call out to engineering operations folks over the weekend or at night. So really have to have a good process around that so you can shut the door to kind of mitigate things. And kind of echo what Mark had said earlier, definitely recommend the leveraging of some third-party solutions. Again, he mentioned Equinox Protector and Transnexus are both really solid products in this area. But those are a good place to start as well.
Okay, good. And I think one thing to not overlook, just as we transition to the next slide, is I know both Mark and Chris have talked about this, is like, what's your internal process for handling these things? And I think a lot of times, we as high tech companies, like, focus on technical solutions, but they forget about the people aspect of it. It says, when I detect it, who do I call? How long do I call? When do I escalate? When do I notify customers? And even I think just getting a grasp on, like, do I have a communications plan for what happens if, I think is something that can be addressed in that meeting. Because even just clearing up that, I think Chris talked about an example earlier where, like, they found the thing and they looked at it for a little while and then realized they couldn't solve it, and it just kept going on until Monday, right? So, like, you want to make sure you have a process for how you handle these things. So I want to close up real quick, like in the last 2 minutes here. Let Mark and Chris kind of say, here's how we can help, right? Here are the things that we do. You've heard little bits and pieces of it today. But Mark, why don't you talk about your CSAN service, and then I'll let Chris talk about Cloudage Solutions.
Yeah, so I saw several of our clients on here who have used us, ECG, for doing security audits. And you can do a security audit as kind of a one-time thing, and then get a report and let your engineering team go and implement those things. And that's great. Glad to help with that. The CSAN service is built on a model where you need to do ongoing review. So if we do a review in January and then the security landscape changes in February, you want to know about that. And so the CSAN service gives you ongoing monitoring. But we look at the configurations, we look at the overall cybersecurity structure. We do use scanning tools, but we use a lot of hand inspection of things like your configuration files and the way that your SIP phones are configured and your SIP trunking is configured, things that are specific to voice. We're the only cybersecurity provider that is able to really have that focus on voice security. And that's what the CSAN does. It gives you an ongoing service to ensure that you're safe and that you're defended, throughout the year, every month of the year.
Hey, Chris. Okay, Chris.
Sure, awesome. Yeah, so on our side, we have both the managed service as well as a SaaS platform that can help in some of these areas. On the managed service side, we have a managed voice cost optimization service where we actually perform the various functions, in the routing analytics, even on the sourcing side, interfacing with existing teams inside, and we kind of establish high performing voice operations. And as mentioned, also there's a SaaS platform we offer that handles a lot of different functions, not just usage. So it's on the service quoting and ordering side, that's for connectivity solutions. We have a network inventory, a cost management. So we'll take in invoice data, validate those, pay those. A lot of analytics come out of that. And then on the usage management side, we have a CDR analytics platform that ingests both vendor and customer CDRs, does validation, can detect fraud issues and other types of cost anomalies, does validation, so re-rating based on rate decks, and that sort of thing. So it's very useful in just getting an overall low cost of operation for voice. Gives you the tools to help you do that. And there's some other contract management and overall analytics on that. So, essentially, if, not all these platforms prevent all potential fraud issues, but, if you have a lower cost structure, then you have a lower event. So that's helpful too. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark and Chris. So I think we left a couple minutes here for we're a couple minutes over where we were hoping to be, but I think there was a good dialogue. I think we got 5 minutes to finish up with Q&A. Karen or Joe, do you have any questions on the chat that you want to throw out to Mark and Chris?
Guys, that was fascinating. It really was. Yeah, a couple one. What are the examples of fraud detection software? And are some of these tools built in to other software components?
So Mark or Chris, you want to grab that?
Did you guys hear me on that?
Yeah. So on the fraud detection side, there's platforms that are dedicated towards that. We mentioned a few third-party platforms like Equinox's Protector, and I think TransNexus and their Nex OSS has an integrated, a fraud detection that's integrated to their routing platform. Other companies have done some homegrown stuff too. But again, what we were saying, we were more, recommending that if a more viable approach, we believe, is to leverage some of those third-party platforms out there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There can be some differences in what's built in. You can see, so the commercial platforms like Equinox, like TransNexus, those are focused only on fraud. There's some platforms like Star2Star, for example, they have some fraud detection built in to their platform, and so as Star2Star partners have that. Whereas other partner platforms, and clearly I'm not going to be able to talk about what's great about all of the different platforms here, but just to give another example, the Cisco Broad Cloud platform. You do your own fraud analysis, so they give you some tools and capabilities to do it, but you provide your own fraud layer, fraud detection layer. So it really varies, and you want to dig in, I think, Joe, on kind of the platform that you're using to provide it, to see what it provides.
Joe, can I ask a question, Joe?
I have a couple more, but before. Yeah, please do it. And by the way, if you folks want to turn on your webcams, feel free to do that. You can open up your mics. And Ian, go ahead, take the floor, please.
Well, guys, I was really interested because, if you know UBOS, you know that we built in a sort of credit lock into the rating engine. So we're kind of slamming the stable door while the horse is trying to get through it. And we cut the value of fraud down dramatically. It's very successful. But you mentioned this sort of small dollar repeat fraud. You got any numbers on that? What sort of, how does that accumulate in a cost to the industry and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I haven't seen any. We've heard it anecdotally. I haven't seen any industry numbers for it. But I know anecdotally you certainly hear about kind of bad actors essentially trying to stay under the radar a little bit, right? It's no different than a lot of, in my opinion, like kind of a lot of fraud you see and across other industries is, how much can you get away with before you trip the wire where people really start to pay attention to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
If it's really low dollar, then it becomes difficult to differentiate between what your customer's saying they didn't make a call or not, right? So there's not a lot. If it's very small and spread across customers, it may go undetected because the customer may just pay the bill, not realize it's on there. So it's when it gets to be, if that's the footprint of or the signature of that type of fraud, then it could be troublesome even to detect, really.
Well, the other question I asked at a UK event not so very long ago, and it just strikes me as really odd. how is it that we as an industry find it so hard to just shut off the upward passing of money? So you know, if I can prove it's fraud, right, and I can prove to my carrier it's fraud, and they can prove to whoever they pass it on to that it's fraud, why do we all have to pay? Because at the end of the day, the money goes to organized crime or terrorism or something. So how come we can't all just agree that if we can prove it's fraud, no dollars pass? I don't get it.
You got to get everyone.
Yeah,
to
that might
agree
be
to that, right?
that might be a little bit more of a regulatory question. Do we have any lawyers on the call? Anybody? Because I think the regulations kind of tie you up on that, Ian.
Yeah. Well, no, as I said, we struggle to get carriers to stop enforcing payment up the food chain. And, you know, even if we got it down to $100 instead of 20,000, who wants to give up $100? I'm Scottish. I don't do that.
Right. I think the end, it's all about like who's the end guy, like he's the guy, you know, and so if you don't pay that party, you know, because some of this, you know, some of these providers, you know, I have no statistics or anything to base this on, but like some of the free conferencing providers, this is probably a significant amount of revenue for them. They're not willing to give that up. I mean, there was a comment because the whole traffic pumping stuff was, you know, there was an order several years ago, the FCC did, to reduce the rates. And basically the comment from some of the free conferencing guys was saying, oh, now that the rate's lower, no one really cares about it, but it's still happening. So unless you can get everyone to give up that money, the guy at the end of the chain that's giving the money and giving it to the bad actor, he still wants to be paid. If you don't pay him, then the calls aren't going to go to that number, right? Or to anywhere. Like legit traffic's not going to go either. So it's definitely it's a difficult problem.
Joe,
Yeah, I think we're getting right here at the end of the time here, Joe.
Joe's muted. Joe's muted.
Just a couple more questions. But Khalid Brown made an interesting comment through the chat. Talked about last year he was due to an asterisk manager interface port 5038 was opened, and the bad guys generated a bunch of calls directly from their PBX. Just a comment on there. Anybody else with questions? Okay, just one more if you don't mind. You talked about automated shutdown becoming more common. Have you seen pushback from customers when that occurs?
I have not. You know, in the incidents, I'm thinking through cases where it happened, and I think the question is that, well, the end user and they're being inconvenienced. Just how inconvenienced were they, and what was on the line, and if they, especially in many cases, the end customer has an agreement in place where they have some obligations around their security. And I think, as Bob and Chris have mentioned, and that the types of fraud events can come in through endpoints and through PBXs and IADs and things. Then sometimes the customer is only appreciative when that shutdown happened, because that was helping to mitigate their own liability in that cost structure. So, but I haven't actually. I can't think of any. It would be anecdotal, but I can't think of any like real customer service meltdowns that happened from that.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, Mark, you know, if you block calls, and even if you get a few legit calls blocked in that for a particular customer, as long as you can tell them, hey, we saved you all this other, because you're in theory the customer's liable for the bill. Obviously, they don't typically pay on a big fraud event, but at least you can say, hey, we blocked these in your best interest as there was an issue. They typically don't go to the FCC on those types of blocking of calls, you know. So
yeah, it ends up being one of those, like, it's the one chance in a million. Like, I mean, you don't want to be the guy who you find out that there's a big investment call and there's a board of director call, and for some reason they get shut off, right? It's longer than normal. Like, no one wants to be the guy that cuts that call off. But I think the reality of it is that's so much more rare, than all the other things that are happening. And I think some of it is just being overly cautious. But you're right. I think anecdotally, you find people are always hesitant to do that. But I think, as an industry, we should be more proactive about doing it.
We should also be careful about there's cutting them off and then there's cutting them off. So there's restricting their ability to place expensive calls. And then there's turning off the customer entirely. If you turn off the customer entirely and you have disabled a service that they would use for calling 911, then you may well have crossed a line. And so just basically intentionally or knowingly stopping fraud calls is different from blocking someone from being able to call for emergency services.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
That makes total sense. Chris, Mark, Bob, thank you guys. Cloudage, thank you guys very much. I found it fascinating. Just a really good. We're going to send around a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording for today's session. You'll get a copy of it. Feel free to reach out to Cloudage. Those guys know what they're doing. We have some webinars coming up. You can see them on the screen there. We'll be sending out some emails to you announcing them. But we want to thank you all for joining us today. And one more time, Cloudage guys, thank you very much. It was really a wonderful webinar, and we do appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Really interesting.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks for everyone that attended too. That's great.
Everybody have a good day.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.